there seems to be less money all the time for ecology. In addition, questions require doing studies across a lot of different locations. The nutrient network is tackled this problem by getting a relatively small grant and organizing research across lots of different sites. I caught up with Eric Lind, postdoc working on the project recently, to talk about you. Can you please briefly introduce yourself and your role at NutNet and how you got involved?
Sure. Well, yeah, I'm Eric Lind, and I'm the postdoc on the project. It's called the Nutrient Network. And I got involved about 2 years ago now. I was hired on as a postdoc, the second postdoc actually for this project. And so my role is to kind of coordinate the network in terms of especially data management, but also communication among all the participants.
Can you provide a brief history of NutNet?
Sure. Well, this project got started in 2006, actually, at an NCEAS working group where they're looking at effects of resources and consumers on different types of communities. And this is a group that Elizabeth Bohr and Eric Seablum were involved in with some other folks. But they basically were frustrated with the meta-analyses that they were doing because there were so few terrestrial examples of the manipulations that they wanted to analyze. And so what they came up with was the idea of, well, we know some people that are interested in this, and we could do kind of a small side experiment in 6, 7 places and then kind of analyze it as a single experiment. And so it was born out of that frustration of meta-analysis, comparing different methodologies and things like that. They decided, well, we'll just do the experiment the same way everywhere we can and see what we get. So that was the idea. Originally fewer than 10 sites, and sort of as they spread the word about what they wanted to do, it kind of blew up. And by 2008 there were 30 to 40 sites, and then now we're up to, in 2012, we're up to 65 sites that are participating in the network in some way. Some experimental, mostly experimental, but some also just observational data. And so yeah, go ahead.
So it didn't start with because you guys got an NSF grant to sort of pay for some of the work, and so it didn't start with the NSF grant.
No, it started as, and I should clarify, the NSF grant is for the coordination, so it pays for me as a postdoc, and it pays for us to have meetings. But it doesn't actually pay for any of the work or the investment in the field, equipment and things like that. So yeah, so it started as this idea that they had people who were interested in the question and could kind of put it in a low-cost basis and then work together to analyze it, which is still the model we're following.
So can you share some stats on NutNet, stuff like how many, well, you just shared, I think, a number of stats, but any more, number of publications, I don't know, database size, or whatever you think is relevant?
Right. I mean, we have so 65 sites. We have they're all based around 5 meter by 5 meter plots. I should say this is all grasslands, herbaceous vegetation, many different types, from old fields to savanna to alpine grasslands, meadows. We've got 15 different countries, 6 continents. At the LTER meeting recently, we heard that there might be a chance that somebody in Antarctica wants to put a NutNet experiment down at Palmer. We'll see if that happens or not, but they do have grass, evidently. But other than that, yeah, so we're distributed pretty widely. We're, like most global experiments, we're concentrated in the US, Europe, Australia for most of our representation. But so yeah, we've got 2,100 or so individual plots, and all of those have data on percent cover by plant species, biomass. Many of them have soil data, light, photosynthetic, active radiation. And as far as the scope of the sort of plant taxonomy, we figured out that we're at about 1,800 species or taxa right now worldwide, which, if you round up, is about 1% of the vascular flora. So we feel like that's a pretty good number to be hitting. So. Yeah, and then our database is still growing because we've gotten up to 5 years of data from a bunch of these sites at this point. So yeah, it's a big resource. As far as publications, we have 3 essentially out right now. We've got about 5 that are either in submission, review, circulating full drafts, and probably about 20 that are in active development as far as manuscripts go.
So, what are some of the focal NutNet research questions? You talked about sort of some of the motivation for starting it, frustration with meta-analysis, but like if you were going to say like, oh, this is the questions that motivate the work, what would they be?
Right. Well, there are actually 3 that are kind of built into the project. The first one is to look at diversity and productivity relationships, which is an old question in ecology. Like, do more productive systems, generate more diversity? Is it only up to a point? The traditional sort of model was this hump-shaped curve where it's sort of like the middle of the productivity spectrum generates the most diversity. And that was a real general question that people wanted to tackle, and that was the first sort of highest profile paper that NutNet has had so far, Adler et al. In Science in 2011. And essentially they attacked this question and said, based on our widespread geographic replication, there's not a general shape to that curve. It varies from place to place. And that's true both at local and regional scales. So that's the first question, diversity, productivity. And then the second 2 are the ones we're answering with experiments. One is, do most grassland communities, are they limited by multiple nutrients? Are they co-limited, or are they sort of just limited by nitrogen, for instance? And so to answer that, we're using factorial additions of nitrogen, phosphorus, and then a bunch of other nutrients, mostly we call it the potassium plus kind of treatment. So that's one thing. And then the final question is whether plant communities are sort of controlled by resources bottom up or consumers top down. And so the final experiment is crossing nutrient addition with vertebrate fencing. And so all of this is kind of contained in a replicate block of 10 plots. And so there is the whole nutrient treatment and the nutrient by fence treatment together in one block. And then most sites have 3 blocks. So it's all in all a very low footprint for any one site. It's about 1,000 square meters or so, tenth of a hectare. So it's the replication, the power, the inference we get is all from the distribution of these sites around the world.
So you have a large number of participants in NutNet. How do you manage the data? And so there was 1, the data, and then 2, the authorship for such a large group.
As far as the data, that was the first thing I sort of tackled. I came on right as the project seemed to be ramping up quite a bit in terms of data flowing in. It was in about the 3rd year of the experiment, so we were adding sites and a lot of data was coming in. So what I did was develop a relational database in MySQL to handle this data and split it out into different tables, but that then can be sort of transparent to users too, so they don't have to deal with the database part. That's sort of like my job. And there are models for doing that. I didn't invent anything necessarily for that. So I feel like the data process is actually pretty stable at this point. The authorship one is a really interesting question because, as I was saying, this is kind of like everybody's side project, but at the same time, this wouldn't really exist, and none of the manuscripts we're working on would exist without all the people doing their part. And so the question of, a significant contribution, for instance, that would establish authorship is a little bit different. So we're handling that a couple different ways. One is that we have what we call opt-out papers, meaning if you implement the experiment and contribute your data, I think for 5 years was the idea, you'll be an author on 2 or 3 core papers that are the main results of the project. For instance, the multiple nutrient limitation paper, or the top-down, bottom-up paper, which is in development at this point. And so, just by doing the experiment, you're an author on these papers. But for most of the other papers that are going to be coming out, it's what we call opt-in, And the idea there is data contribution is just the first step. It gets you in the door. From then on, you have to contribute in other more traditional ways, developing analysis, writing, what have you, to be an author. And so the authorship lists are going to be maybe longer than traditional, single site studies, but they shouldn't all be, 70 authors, for instance. And then we have a sort of grandiose name for it is the authorship committee, but we have a couple people who are not sort of in the headquarters here who are tasked with kind of resolving disputes if those come up. They haven't really yet, but we have people that are sort of making sure that manuscripts in development are not overlapping too much, that people feel like they're getting a fair shake, either getting added to or taken off papers, whatever it is. So we're trying to kind of feel our way through that process, but it's really a something we're developing still. We're trying to learn from other big projects. There's an experiment in Germany called the Jena Biodiversity Experiment, which is a huge multi-collaborator experiment, and they have a lot of different processes for acquiring data, and sort of more rigorous and formal than we want to use, but there are some things we've been learning from them about just sort of communication about what data you plan to use and how, and then whether people can contribute to your project. So, one more thing, just I should mention that, so for all the papers that NutNet is putting out, we're attaching as an appendix an authorship rubric. It's a matrix, it's just authors and then maybe 5 or 6 columns of the types of contributions that they made. And so this will be on every NutNet paper, so you will be able to evaluate actually what people did, what pieces they did contribute.
So there's, decreasing funding for science, budgets seem to be being slashed for NIH and NSF and all the other agencies. So this sort of low-cost distributed research network seems like a pretty interesting and promising model. Have you heard of others that have copied your model, or others, at least talking about it?
Yeah, there are a few others, other networks, some that exist, other RCN projects. One in particular called GLEON, or the Great Lakes Ecological Observatory Network. That's one that was nearly simultaneous to NutNet and uses a totally different model because it's an observational network, but they have a very similar sort of distributed structure and cost structure. There is a project called the Zostra Ecology Network, or ZEN, which is one that is more or less an aquatic version of Nutrient Network. They're doing fertilization and fencing out crustaceans in near-shore seagrass beds. And then I know of one that's in development that people are trying to get off the ground, dealing with rainfall manipulation in grasslands around the world. So I think this model, we hope, is something that people will do. And I think whenever we talk about it, we try to make the point that this is definitely a generic thing that you can apply to whatever the question is that you're interested in. If there is a question that would benefit from geographic replication rather than single site intense study, and you can kind of come up with a relatively easy way to manipulate it, this is a good model to follow. And we're hoping to sort of impart some of the things we've learned in the process as well. So that'll be a challenge. But as far as the science, I think most of that should be able to continue.